Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet sanctuary we share together tonight. I am grateful you have found your way here to this peaceful refuge from the noise and chaos of the world. If you feel moved to do so, share with me what hour it is where you are and from what corner of the earth you are listening. Tonight, I offer you a precious collection of ancient tales from forgotten Zen monasteries, stories whispered between masters and students in moonlit gardens and silent meditation halls. Each narrative carries within it a luminous truth about releasing the burdens we carry, about finding stillness in a restless world, and about discovering the peace that has always lived within you. These are not merely bedtime stories to help you drift away. They are keys, carefully forged by enlightened minds across centuries, designed to unlock the doors of your own inner temple. The great teacher Linji once said, "If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him." What he meant was this: true awakening cannot be found outside yourself. It must be discovered within. As these timeless teachings unfold before you, something miraculous will begin to occur. The tension you have been holding will start to dissolve. The endless stream of thoughts will gradually slow to a gentle trickle. The weight that has been pressing on your chest will lift like morning mist rising from a valley. You will find yourself settling into a state of awareness so natural, so effortless, that you will wonder why you ever believed peace was something you had to chase. So allow yourself now to release the day completely. Let your body sink deeper into whatever surface supports you. Take one slow, conscious breath, drawing it in through your nose and releasing it through your mouth. And as that breath leaves your body, let it carry away everything that no longer serves you. Open your heart to receive these ancient transmissions, for they have traveled through time itself to find you here in this exact moment, ready to guide you home to yourself. Let us begin our journey with a story about authenticity and the courage required to live according to our deepest truth. In the northern mountains where winter snow fell thick and summers brought brief explosions of wildflower color, there stood an ancient monastery known throughout the region for its strict adherence to traditional forms. The monks rose before dawn, sat in rigid meditation postures for hours, chanted sutras with perfect precision, and maintained absolute silence during prescribed periods. Every gesture was choreographed. Every movement had been passed down through generations. Discipline and order were considered the foundation of all spiritual progress. Among these devoted practitioners lived a monk named Ryokan. He had come to the monastery as a young man, filled with sincere longing to understand the nature of existence. He practiced diligently, learning all the forms and rituals expected of him. He bowed at the proper angles, recited the correct phrases, and performed his duties with careful attention. But as years passed, something within Ryokan began to shift. The formal practices that once felt meaningful started to feel hollow. The precise rituals that once connected him to something greater now seemed to separate him from direct experience. He found himself going through motions mechanically, his body performing while his spirit wandered elsewhere. One spring morning during communal meditation, as cherry blossoms drifted past the meditation hall windows, Ryokan suddenly stood up in the middle of the session. This was absolutely forbidden. Meditation periods were sacred, and breaking the silence with movement was considered deeply disrespectful to the practice and to fellow monks. Without offering explanation or apology, Ryokan walked calmly out of the hall. He removed his formal meditation robes and changed into simple work clothes. Then he walked into the monastery garden and began pulling weeds with complete attention, humming quietly to himself as he worked. The other monks were scandalized. When the meditation period ended, they rushed to report this outrageous behavior to the abbot, a stern elderly man named Hakun, who had maintained the monastery's rigorous standards for 3 decades. Abbot Hakun summoned Ryokan to his quarters. The younger monk arrived with dirt still under his fingernails and bits of leaves clinging to his simple robe. He bowed respectfully, but without the elaborate formality usually required in the abbot's presence. "Ryokan," the abbot began, his voice carrying both disappointment and confusion. You have broken a fundamental rule of our community. You disrupted meditation, abandoned your practice, and showed disrespect to your brothers. What explanation can you possibly offer for such behavior? Ryokan met his teacher's gaze with clear, calm eyes. Abbot, I cannot pretend anymore. Sitting in that hall this morning, I realized I was simply imitating the appearance of meditation while my mind raced with distractions. I was performing the form of practice while the essence had completely disappeared. The weeds in the garden needed attention, and I could give them my full presence. That felt more honest than sitting on my cushion pretending to be enlightened. The abbot's expression hardened. You think manual labor is more important than meditation. You believe your individual feelings matter more than our collective discipline. This is spiritual arrogance, Ryokan. You set yourself apart, deciding that your personal truth exceeds our traditions. I do not claim my way is superior. Ryokan replied gently. I only know that I cannot continue performing authentic practice when authenticity has vanished. If I am to discover truth, it must be through genuine engagement with each moment, not through elaborate pretense. The abbot stood, his decision made. Then you cannot remain here. A monastery requires unity of practice. If each monk simply follows his own impulses, we have chaos rather than discipline. You must leave by tomorrow's dawn. Ryokan bowed deeply, feeling no anger or resentment. Thank you, teacher, for the years of training you have provided. I will carry those teachings with me, but I must now discover how they live in my own direct experience. The next morning, as promised, Ryokan departed the monastery. He carried only a small bundle of possessions and his begging bowl. Rather than seeking another monastery or teacher, he found a simple hut in the mountains where he could live alone. There, without the structure of communal rules or the pressure to perform spiritual advancement, Ryokan discovered something remarkable. When he sat in meditation, it was because sitting felt like the natural expression of that moment. When he worked in his small garden, he gave it complete attention without dividing his mind between the task and some idea about what he should be doing instead. When children from nearby villages came to play, he played with them fully, laughing and running without concern for maintaining a dignified spiritual image. Word began to spread about the hermit monk who lived with such simplicity and joy. People who visited his hut reported feeling immediate peace in his presence. Unlike the stern monks in the monastery, who always seemed to be striving toward some distant goal, Ryokan embodied a natural ease that suggested he had already arrived. Years later, Abbot Hakun, now very old and approaching death, sent a message requesting that Ryokan visit him one final time. When the hermit monk arrived at the monastery, he found his former teacher lying on a simple mat, his body frail, but his eyes still sharp. Ryokan, the old abbot whispered, I have spent my life maintaining the forms of our tradition, believing that discipline and structure were the path to realization. But as death approaches, I find myself wondering if I have mistaken the container for the contents. Tell me, in your simple hut with no rules and no community to maintain, have you found what we have been seeking? Ryokan took his teacher's thin hand and smiled with boundless compassion. Master, you taught me everything I needed to know. The forms and rituals you maintained gave me a foundation. But yes, I had to leave them behind to discover what they were pointing toward. It is like learning to write calligraphy. First, you must practice the strokes exactly as taught, following every rule with precision. But eventually, you must forget the rules and let the brush move naturally, carrying the essence of what was learned without being bound by the form. The old abbot closed his eyes, and a tear rolled down his weathered cheek. I understand now. I have been practicing calligraphy my entire life without ever putting down the instruction manual to simply write. Thank you for showing me this before the end. 3 days later, Abbot Hakun passed away peacefully in his sleep. At the funeral, the monastery monks were surprised to see Ryokan arrive, dressed in his simple hermit clothes, carrying wildflowers instead of formal offerings. He placed the flowers beside his teacher's body and bowed with genuine love and gratitude, performing the gesture not because protocol required it, but because his heart overflowed with feeling. As the Buddha taught, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because it is spoken and rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found written in your religious books. But after observation and analysis, when you find that anything agrees with reason and is conducive to the good and benefit of one and all, then accept it and live up to it. What emerges from this story is a profound teaching about the difference between authentic practice and mere performance. Why do we so often mistake the appearance of spiritual development for the actual transformation? Buddhist psychology reveals that we become attached to forms because they are visible and measurable. We can count how many hours we meditate, how many texts we have studied, how many rules we follow. This creates the comfortable illusion that we are making progress. But genuine awakening often requires us to release these measurements and dive into the unmeasurable depths of direct experience. Ryokan's courage was not in rejecting discipline entirely, but in recognizing when discipline had become a substitute for genuine presence. The monastery's rituals served an important purpose for developing concentration and building a container for practice. But when those rituals became more important than the awareness they were meant to cultivate, they transformed from tools into obstacles. Consider your own spiritual life, whether you identify as Buddhist or follow some other path. Where might you be performing the appearance of growth while avoiding the difficult work of real transformation? Perhaps you attend religious services, but find your mind wandering the entire time. Perhaps you post inspirational quotes on social media, but struggle to embody those teachings in difficult moments. Perhaps you own shelves of spiritual books, but have never actually applied a single practice with consistent dedication. The teaching here is not that structure and discipline are worthless. Rather, it is that we must remain awake to whether our practices are serving their true purpose or have become comfortable habits that allow us to avoid deeper challenges. Zen Master Dogen wrote, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by 10,000 things." Ryokan forgot his carefully constructed identity as a disciplined monk, and in that forgetting, he discovered his true nature. There is a subtle trap in all spiritual communities where we can become more concerned with appearing awakened than with actually awakening. We learn the correct language, adopt the proper behaviors, and surround ourselves with others who validate our spiritual identity. But underneath this performance, has anything fundamentally shifted in how we experience reality? Authentic practice requires tremendous courage because it demands that we be honest about our actual experience, rather than pretending to have experiences we think we should have. If meditation feels dead and mechanical, we must acknowledge that rather than pretending we are dwelling in blissful emptiness. If compassion feels forced and performative, we must admit that rather than congratulating ourselves for going through compassionate motions. This honesty is not a failure of practice, but its very foundation. We cannot heal what we refuse to see. We cannot transform what we keep hidden behind spiritual pretense. Look deeply at your own relationship with authenticity. In what areas of your life do you perform rather than genuinely engage? This pattern extends far beyond formal spiritual practice. We perform the role of the good employee, the devoted parent, the loyal friend, sometimes losing touch with what we actually think and feel beneath these performances. Tonight, as you settle into rest, can you give yourself permission to release all performance? Can you stop trying to be someone who is good at sleeping, someone who is successfully relaxing, someone who is doing meditation correctly? Can you simply be exactly as you are, with all your restlessness, all your thoughts, all your imperfections, and discover that this raw authenticity is itself a doorway to peace. The Buddha said, 3 things cannot be long hidden: the sun, the moon, and the truth. Your true nature cannot be hidden forever beneath layers of performance. Eventually, like Ryokan walking out of the meditation hall, something in you will demand authenticity. The question is whether you will have the courage to honor that demand. High in the mountains where eagles built their nests on cliff faces and streams sang their way down stone steps carved by centuries of flowing water, there stood a temple known for housing monks who had mastered the art of endurance. These were not ordinary practitioners. They were considered the most dedicated, the most disciplined, the most spiritually advanced monks in the entire region. The temple was famous for its austerity practices. Monks slept only 4 hours each night on bare wooden platforms. They ate 1 small meal per day, consuming only rice and pickled vegetables. They sat in meditation for 8 hours daily, forbidden to adjust their posture regardless of physical pain. During winter, they practiced without heat, believing that conquering the body's complaints led to spiritual transcendence. During summer, they wore heavy robes, training themselves to remain unmoved by discomfort. Visitors came from distant provinces to witness these extraordinary monks who could sit motionless as statues while mosquitoes fed on their faces, who never complained despite obvious hunger, who showed no reaction to physical hardship. Many believed these monks had achieved the highest level of spiritual realization through their ability to transcend suffering. A young seeker named Daichi heard stories of this remarkable temple and decided he must train there. He arrived after weeks of travel, his feet blistered and his body exhausted. But when he saw the monks sitting in perfect stillness despite obvious discomfort, he felt he had finally found true masters. The head monk, a gaunt man named Tenshin, with a face like carved wood and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things, accepted Daichi as a student. Here you will learn to conquer your body's weakness and your mind's endless complaints. Suffering is a choice. We choose not to suffer by rising above our physical sensations. Daichi threw himself into the austere practices with fierce determination. He slept his 4 hours and felt constantly exhausted. He ate his 1 small meal and felt perpetually hungry. He sat through the 8-hour meditation sessions while his legs screamed and his back ached. He wore heavy robes in the summer heat and felt sweat pour down his body. But he endured. He gritted his teeth and endured because he believed this was the path to enlightenment. Months passed. Daichi noticed something troubling. Despite their reputation and their extreme discipline, the monks seemed deeply unhappy. Their faces carried not peace, but rigidity. Their movements were tense rather than graceful. Conversations were minimal, and when they spoke, there was often a subtle edge of irritation in their voices. They appeared to be men at war with themselves, constantly suppressing, constantly fighting, constantly pushing away natural responses. One autumn afternoon, a traveling teacher named Soen O arrived at the temple seeking shelter for the night. This teacher was different from anyone Daichi had encountered. He walked with an ease that suggested complete comfort in his body. He smiled readily, and his eyes sparkled with genuine warmth. When offered the temple's meager meal, he accepted it with obvious gratitude, eating slowly and appearing to enjoy every bite of the plain rice. That evening, Zoen was invited to give a talk to the monks. They gathered in the cold hall, sitting in their perfectly rigid postures, expecting to be impressed by his teaching. Instead, Soen looked around at the assembled monks with unmistakable sadness in his eyes. "Tell me," he said quietly, "why do you torture yourselves?" The monks stirred uncomfortably. Tenshin spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of defensiveness. "We do not torture ourselves. We train ourselves. We transcend the body's limitations and the mind's weakness. This is the path the Buddha taught." Soen shook his head slowly. The Buddha tried extreme asceticism before his awakening. He starved himself until his ribs showed through his skin. He sat in painful postures until his body nearly failed. And you know what he discovered? That this path leads away from awakening rather than toward it. After nearly dying from these practices, he accepted milk rice from a young girl and decided to follow what he called the middle way. Not indulgence, but not self-torture either. He paused, letting his words settle into the uncomfortable silence. I see men here who are proud of their ability to endure suffering, but I do not see men who have transcended suffering. You have simply become very skilled at suppressing your awareness of it. This is not freedom. This is a particular form of bondage. Tension's face flushed with anger. You know nothing of our practice or our realization. We have mastered what weak practitioners like yourself could never achieve. Have you? Soen asked gently. Then why does your jaw clench when you speak? Why do your shoulders carry so much tension? Why do your eyes carry exhaustion rather than clarity? True mastery does not look like constant warfare with oneself. He stood and walked to where a mosquito had landed on one monk's face. The monk sat perfectly still, demonstrating his transcendence by allowing the insect to feed. Soen gently brushed the mosquito away. This mosquito is hungry, and you have decided its hunger is more important than your comfort. But tell me, if your child were hungry and asked for food, would you deny them to prove your spiritual advancement? Would you let them starve while you sat in rigid meditation? Of course not. You would feed them with love. Why then do you treat yourself with less compassion than you would show your own child? Daichi felt something crack open in his chest as he listened. For months, he had been treating his body like an enemy to be conquered, his natural needs like weaknesses to be eliminated. He had believed that peace came through winning a war against himself. But looking at Soen's relaxed presence and comparing it to Tension's rigid tension, he suddenly understood that he had been walking in the wrong direction. That night, unable to sleep on the hard wooden platform, Daichi made a decision. At dawn, he approached Soen, who was preparing to leave. "Teacher," Daichi said, "may I travel with you? I want to learn this middle way you speak of." Soen smiled warmly. "Of course. But understand, this path requires different courage. It is easy to be hard on yourself. What takes real bravery is learning to be kind to yourself while remaining committed to awakening." As they walked away from the temple, Daichi looked back at the monks beginning their morning meditation session. They sat like statues, proud of their endurance. But for the first time, he could see that their stillness was not peace but suppression. Their discipline not freedom, but a different form of bondage. Over the following months traveling with Soen, Daichi learned a completely different approach. When his body was tired, he rested. When he was hungry, he ate mindfully and with gratitude. When sitting in meditation became painful, he adjusted his posture rather than fighting through agony. And paradoxically, by caring for his body with kindness rather than treating it as an enemy, his meditation grew deeper and his mind clearer than it had ever been at the austere temple. One day he asked Soen, "How do we know the difference between self-care and self-indulgence? I worried that if I listened to my body's needs, I would become lazy and undisciplined." Soen laughed. "There is a vast territory between torturing yourself and spoiling yourself. The middle way asks you to pay attention to what your body and mind actually need for health and clarity, then provide those things without excess. You feed yourself enough to be nourished, but not so much that you become sluggish. You rest enough to restore energy, but not so much that you become lethargic. You challenge yourself enough to grow, but not so much that you damage yourself. This requires more wisdom than simply following rigid rules." The Buddha taught, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. This profound wisdom points directly to what Daiichi discovered at the Temple of Unnecessary Suffering. Why do we believe that spiritual progress requires self-punishment? This pattern has roots in many religious traditions that confused transcendence with rejection, liberation with warfare against the self. We inherited the belief that the body is sinful, that natural needs are weaknesses, and that enlightenment comes through conquering our humanity rather than embracing it. Buddhist psychology recognizes what it calls the near enemy of virtue. This refers to qualities that appear similar to spiritual attainments, but are actually distortions of them. The near enemy of discipline is rigidity. The near enemy of transcendence is suppression. The near enemy of detachment is dissociation. The monks in the temple believed they were practicing discipline, but they had crossed into rigidity. They thought they were transcending suffering, but they were simply suppressing awareness of it. They imagined they were developing detachment, but they had actually become dissociated from their own direct experience. Consider your own relationship with self-care. In what ways do you punish yourself under the guise of self-improvement? Perhaps you push through exhaustion, telling yourself that rest is lazy. Perhaps you skip meals, convincing yourself that hunger is discipline. Perhaps you ignore your body's pain signals, believing that listening to them would be weak. This pattern extends beyond physical self-care into emotional and mental domains as well. How often do you berate yourself for having feelings you judge as unspiritual? How frequently do you criticize yourself for thoughts you believe you should not have? How consistently do you treat yourself with a harshness you would never inflict on someone you love? The great Tibetan teacher, Pema Chodron writes, "The most fundamental aggression to ourselves, the most fundamental harm we can do to ourselves, is to remain ignorant by not having the courage and the respect to look at ourselves honestly and gently." Notice that she says honestly and gently. Both are required. The middle way that Buddha discovered and that Soen embodied is not about perfect balance in every moment. Rather, it is about developing the wisdom to discern what is actually needed in each situation and the compassion to provide it. Sometimes what is needed is challenge and discipline. Sometimes what is needed is rest and gentleness. Neither is inherently more spiritual than the other. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, notice if there is any way you are being unnecessarily harsh with yourself. Perhaps you are criticizing yourself for not falling asleep quickly enough. Perhaps you are judging yourself for the thoughts arising in your mind. Perhaps you are disappointed that you are not more relaxed already. What if you could release all that? What if you could treat yourself with the same tenderness you would offer a beloved child who cannot sleep? What if your practice tonight was simply to be kind to yourself exactly as you are? The Buddha said, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal." This applies to how we treat ourselves as well. We cannot hate ourselves into enlightenment. We cannot criticize ourselves into peace. We cannot wage war on ourselves and expect to find freedom. True transformation comes not through violence against ourselves, but through meeting ourselves with radical acceptance and tender care. This is the middle way, and it leads home, in a valley where morning mist gathered like breath between sleeping mountains. There sat a monastery so old that no one could remember when it was first built. The temple buildings had been repaired and rebuilt countless times across centuries, but the spirit of the place remained constant, maintained by generation after generation of monks who dedicated their lives to awakening. The current abbot was a man named Kaido, who had spent 40 years in this monastery. He had arrived as an eager teenager with romantic notions about enlightenment, thinking he would achieve profound realization within a few years, and then spend his life dispensing wisdom to grateful students. Instead, he had found that genuine practice was far more humble and ordinary than his youthful imagination had conceived. Now in his 60s, Cato served as abbot not because he claimed any special attainment, but simply because he had been there longer than anyone else, and someone had to organize the practical affairs of communal life. He scheduled work assignments, managed the monastery's modest finances, settled disputes when they arose, and tried his best to support each monk's practice according to their individual needs. But Cato had a hobby that mystified the other, monks. Whenever he had a spare hour or two, he could be found on the hillside behind the monastery with a shovel and a bucket of saplings. He was planting trees, hundreds of them over the years, across acres of hillside that had been stripped bare by logging decades before his arrival. The work was slow and physically demanding. Cato would dig a hole in the rocky soil, carefully place a sapling, pack earth around its roots, and water it thoroughly. Then he would move a few feet and repeat the process. Day after day, year after year, the old man planted trees. One spring afternoon, a young monk named Jiro approached the abbot on the hillside. Jiro had been at the monastery for only 6 months and was still full of urgency about his spiritual development. He watched Cato working for several minutes before speaking. "Abbot, forgive me for interrupting your work, but I have been wondering something. Why do you spend so much time planting these trees? Most of them will not reach maturity in your lifetime. You will never see this hillside fully forested. You will never sit in the shade of these trees or enjoy their beauty when they are grown. It seems like wasted effort when your time could be spent in meditation or study." Cato paused in his digging and leaned on his shovel, breathing heavily from the exertion. He looked at Jiro with eyes that carried both amusement and deep sadness at having to explain something so obvious. "Tell me, Jiro, when you arrived at this monastery 6 months ago, what did you find?" "I found beautiful old buildings," Jiro replied, somewhat confused by the question. "I found meditation halls and gardens, and a library full of ancient texts." "And did you build those buildings?" "Of course not. They were built long before I was born." "Did you plant the gardens that provide vegetables for our meals?" "No. Those were planted by monks who came before me." "Did you copy and preserve the texts in our library?" "No. That work was done by previous generations." Cato nodded slowly. "Then you understand. We live on the generosity of people we will never meet. Every meal you eat grows from soil enriched by the labor of monks long dead. Every night you sleep under a roof maintained by workers whose names are forgotten. Every teaching you study was preserved by scribes who spent their lives carefully copying texts so that future seekers might benefit." He gestured toward the young saplings dotting the hillside. "I plant these trees for monks who will arrive at this monastery 50 years after I am gone. They will meditate in the shade of these groves. They will listen to leaves rustling in the wind and perhaps find peace in that sound. They will gather fallen branches for firewood during cold winters. And if they are wise, they will understand that unknown people from the past planted these trees as a gift to them." Jiro felt something shift in his chest as he absorbed this teaching. His entire approach to practice had been focused on what he could achieve, what realizations he could gain, what benefits would come to him. He had never considered that his purpose might be to contribute to something far beyond his individual life. "But how do you maintain motivation?" Jiro asked, "when you know you will never see the results of your work?" Cato smiled and returned to his digging. "The results are not the point. The planting itself is the point. Each time I place a sapling in the earth, I am expressing gratitude for all the gifts I have received from people I never knew. I am participating in a chain of generosity that extends backward and forward through time. This is not sacrifice or obligation. It is joy." He paused and looked directly at Jiro. "The Buddha taught that all phenomena arise through interdependence. Nothing exists in isolation. You are not a separate self, struggling alone to achieve personal enlightenment. You are a temporary manifestation of countless causes and conditions, and everything you do ripples outward in ways you cannot measure or control. When you understand this deeply, the question of whether you personally benefit becomes irrelevant. Over the following years, Jiro observed Kato's example more carefully. He noticed that the abbot approached every task with the same patient dedication he brought to planting trees. Whether repairing a leaking roof, teaching a confused student, or sitting in meditation, Kato worked with steady presence, apparently unconcerned with achieving visible results or earning recognition. One day, Jiro asked permission to join the tree planting work. Kato handed him a shovel without comment, and they worked side by side in comfortable silence. Jiro found that there was something deeply satisfying about this simple labor. Placing each sapling in the ground felt like an act of faith in the future, a gesture of care toward people he would never meet. As years passed, Jiro noticed changes in himself. His earlier urgency about personal achievement had given way to something subtler and more sustainable. He no longer measured each meditation session by whether he had experienced anything special. He no longer evaluated each day by whether he felt he had made progress toward enlightenment. Instead, he found meaning in simply showing up, doing what was in front of him with care and attention, and trusting that his small efforts were contributing to something larger than his individual life. Decades later, when Kato was very old and approaching death, the monastery held a ceremony honoring his years of service. Monks came from other temples to pay respects. During the ceremony, several people spoke about the abbot's wisdom teachings and his skillful leadership. But what moved Kato most deeply was when a group of young monks who had joined the community recently led everyone up to the hillside behind the monastery. The saplings he had planted over 40 years had grown into a beautiful young forest. The monks had built a small meditation platform among the trees, and they described how they loved to sit there in the early morning, listening to birds singing in the branches, feeling cool shade on hot days, and knowing that some unknown person from the past had planted these trees as a gift to them. Kato wept quietly, not because he was proud of his accomplishment, but because he felt the living truth of interconnection. He was part of an endless chain of giving and receiving that extended far beyond his individual existence. He had received so many gifts from the past. He had passed on what he could to the future. This was enough. This had always been enough. A few weeks later, Kato died peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, each monk placed a pine cone on his funeral pyre, seeds that would be planted in his memory, continuing the work he had embodied. The Buddha taught, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. This ancient wisdom points to the heart of Kato's life teaching. Why do we become so fixated on outcomes we can measure and achievements we can claim as our own? Modern culture trains us to think transactionally. We invest effort expecting returns. We work anticipating rewards. We give while calculating what we will receive. This creates a fundamental misunderstanding about how genuine fulfillment arises. Buddhist philosophy speaks of the far-reaching effects of karma, but not in the simplistic sense of cosmic scorekeeping. Rather, it points to the truth that everything we do sends ripples through the vast web of interconnection that constitutes reality. Every action influences conditions in ways we cannot predict or measure. A single kind word to a stranger might change their day, which changes how they interact with others, which influences conditions for people we will never meet. Kato understood that his individual life was temporary, but what he contributed to the flow of generosity was timeless. He was not planting trees for himself. He was participating in an ancient practice of caring for future generations, just as past generations had cared for him. Consider your own relationship with time and legacy. How much energy do you spend trying to accomplish things you can finish and claim credit for? How often do you avoid undertaking projects that extend beyond your lifetime? This reveals an attachment to the illusion that you are a separate, permanent self who needs to maximize personal achievement before death. What if instead You saw yourself as Kaido learned to see himself, as a temporary participant in an endless flow of giving and receiving, where your purpose is simply to care well for whatever is entrusted to you during your brief time here, knowing that others will continue the work after you are gone. This perspective transforms everything. Work becomes an expression of love rather than a means to an end. Effort becomes joyful rather than burdensome. Failure becomes impossible because the outcome is not the point. The quality of attention and care you bring to each moment is what matters. Zen Master Shunryu Suzuki taught, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." Kaido maintained beginner's mind even after 40 years of practice. Each sapling was planted with fresh attention, as if it were the first tree he had ever planted, as if the outcome were completely unknown, as if the only thing that mattered was doing this one task fully. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, consider what trees you might be planting without realizing it. Perhaps it is the patience you show a frustrated child, seeds of emotional regulation that will bear fruit in their adult life. Perhaps it is the quality of your work, standards of excellence that will influence people you never meet. Perhaps it is the kindness you offer stressed strangers, small gestures that might shift their entire day. You will never know the full consequences of your actions. The tree you plant today might provide shade for someone a century from now. The encouraging word you offer might change someone's life trajectory in ways you will never hear about. This uncertainty is not a limitation, but a liberation. You are freed from the burden of managing outcomes and can simply focus on planting seeds with care and love. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Better than 1,000 grand achievements you can claim are small acts of generosity you offer without needing recognition. This is the path Kaido walked, and it leads to a peace that extends far beyond individual life. In a monastery, nestled between two rivers, where the sound of flowing water was a constant companion to meditation practice, there lived a young monk named Takeshi who carried a secret burden of shame. While his fellow practitioners could sit motionless for hours in the meditation hall, their bodies still as carved stone and their minds apparently dwelling in profound states of concentration, Takeshi found every meditation session to be an excruciating battle with his own restless energy. His legs would fall asleep within 20 minutes, sending painful tingles through his calves. His back would begin to ache, demanding that he shift position. His nose would itch maddeningly. His mind would race with thoughts, jumping from memory to fantasy to worry with such speed that he could barely track the movement. And worst of all, an almost irresistible urge to move would build within him until he felt he might scream if he had to remain still for one more moment. Takeshi tried everything he could think of to overcome this restlessness. He would wake early to do additional meditation before the community sessions, hoping that extra practice would train his unruly body and mind. He studied texts about concentration techniques, memorizing instructions about focusing on the breath or counting inhalations. He even secretly reduced his food intake, believing that perhaps eating less would make him lighter and calmer. Nothing worked. Session after session, he would watch his fellow monks sitting in apparent peace while he squirmed internally, fighting desperately to maintain the appearance of stillness, even as everything inside him screamed for movement. He became convinced that he was fundamentally defective, lacking some essential quality that made others capable of proper meditation, while he remained trapped in this restless body. The shame grew heavier with each passing week. Takeshi began to avoid eye contact with other monks, certain they could see his inadequacy. He stopped asking questions during teaching sessions, afraid his questions would reveal his inability to achieve even basic concentration. He considered leaving the monastery entirely, convinced he was wasting everyone's time with his failed attempts at practice. One morning, after a particularly difficult meditation session, during which Takeshi had nearly given up and walked out, He found himself sitting alone in the garden, tears of frustration running down his face. He did not notice when the monastery's eldest teacher, a woman named Mayoko, who rarely spoke, but whose presence carried tremendous depth, came and sat beside him on the stone bench. They sat in silence for several minutes while Takeshi tried to compose himself, embarrassed to be seen in such a state by this revered teacher. Finally, Miyoko spoke in a voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear. "You are suffering greatly in your meditation practice." It was not a question, but a simple observation. Takeshi nodded miserably, unable to find words. "Tell me," Miyoko continued, "what do you believe meditation should feel like?" "Like the others," Takeshi replied quietly. "Peaceful, still, concentrated. My mind should be calm, and my body should be able to sit without all this restlessness." "I see. And where did you learn what meditation should feel like?" Takeshi paused, confused by the question. "From watching the other monks, from the teachings about developing concentration, from descriptions of meditation in the texts." Miyoko smiled gently. "So, you have created an idea in your mind about what your experience should be, and now you spend every meditation session comparing your actual experience to this ideal image, finding yourself lacking." Takeshi felt something crack open as he recognized the truth of her words. Yes, exactly that. This comparing mind, this judging mind that constantly measures your experience against some imagined standard, tell me, is this mind peaceful? No, Takeshi admitted. It is the opposite of peaceful. Then perhaps, Mayoko said slowly, the obstacle is not your restless body or your wandering thoughts. Perhaps the obstacle is your war against your restless body and wandering thoughts. Perhaps the obstacle is your belief that your natural experience is wrong and needs to be fixed. She gestured toward the garden, where a butterfly was moving erratically from flower to flower, never staying in one place for more than a moment. Is that butterfly meditating incorrectly because it cannot sit still? Despite his misery, Takeshi almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Of course not. That is simply its nature. And what is your nature? Takeshi sat with this question, feeling how his entire body was alive with energy, with sensation, with movement. I suppose my nature is to move, to feel, to experience life through my senses rather than through stillness. Mayoko nodded. Then why do you try to force yourself to have a different nature? The Buddha taught many forms of meditation. Sitting meditation is only one. There is walking meditation, where you move slowly and feel each step. There is working meditation, where you bring full attention to physical tasks. There is movement meditation, where you allow the body to express its natural energy. All of these are valid paths. She stood and beckoned for Takeshi to follow her. They walked to a clear area behind the garden, where Miyoko began to move in slow-flowing gestures that reminded Takeshi of Tai Chi, but seemed more spontaneous, more responsive to inner impulses than to memorized forms. "Try this," she said. "Close your eyes and simply allow your body to move however it wants to move. Do not try to control it or make it move in any particular way. Just feel the energy in your body and let it express itself through movement." Takeshi felt ridiculous at first, but he closed his eyes and began to sway slightly. The movement felt good, so he allowed it to become larger. His arms began to rise and fall. His spine began to twist and uncoil. Soon he was moving freely, stretching, bending, turning, allowing years of suppressed kinetic energy to finally flow through his limbs. He moved for perhaps 20 minutes, losing track of time entirely. When he finally came to stillness naturally, his body having expressed what it needed to express, he felt more peaceful than he had experienced in any of his forced sitting meditations. His mind was quiet, not because he had conquered it, but because he had finally stopped fighting it. Opening his eyes, he saw Miyoko watching with warm approval. "Now sit," she said simply. Takeshi lowered himself to the ground and sat in meditation posture. To his amazement, his body felt different. The restlessness that usually tormented him was absent. His muscles were relaxed rather than tense. His mind, having been allowed to move freely through the body meditation, now rested easily without the constant pressure to be somewhere other than where it was. He sat effortlessly for an hour, and when the monastery bell rang calling everyone to the midday meal, he opened his eyes feeling he had just touched something genuine in his practice for the first time since arriving at the monastery. Over the following months, Takeshi developed his own practice rhythm. Before each sitting meditation, he would spend time in movement meditation, allowing his body to discharge its natural energy. He discovered that after moving freely, he could sit with real ease, not forcing stillness, but finding it naturally. He also began to appreciate walking meditation, which allowed him to maintain meditative awareness while honoring his body's need for movement. Most importantly, he stopped comparing his practice to anyone else's. He recognized that each person's path is unique, shaped by their individual constitution, temperament, and life circumstances. What looked like peaceful sitting in his fellow monks might have been their own internal struggles. What felt like shameful restlessness in himself was actually his body's wisdom trying to guide him toward a practice that honored his true nature. Years later, when Takeshi had become a teacher himself, students with similar struggles would often seek him out. To each one, he would say, "Do not try to force your practice into someone else's shape." The Buddha offered countless methods because he understood that human beings are infinitely diverse. Your job is not to become someone else. Your job is to discover what genuine practice looks like for you, in this particular body, with this particular mind, in these particular circumstances. The Buddha taught, "Be a lamp unto yourself. Be your own refuge. Seek no other." This profound wisdom points directly to what Takeshi discovered through his suffering and eventual liberation. Why do we assume that spiritual practice should look the same for everyone? This misconception arises from our tendency to believe that there is one correct way to awaken, one proper method that works universally. But Buddhist history reveals tremendous diversity in approach. Some practitioners achieved realization through intensive sitting meditation. Others found awakening through physical labor. Some discovered truth through scholarly study. Others awakened through devotional practice or ethical service. The teaching is not that any method works equally well for everyone, but rather that genuine practice must be aligned with your actual constitution and circumstances rather than some abstract ideal. What serves one person may hinder another. What comes easily to one practitioner may be nearly impossible for another. Contemporary neuroscience supports this ancient wisdom. Research reveals that human nervous systems vary dramatically in their baseline arousal levels, sensory processing sensitivity, and capacity for stillness. Some people naturally have calm, underreactive nervous systems that settle easily into extended stillness. Others have highly energetic, reactive nervous systems that require movement to process stimulation and find balance. Neither type is superior or more spiritual. They are simply different, requiring different approaches to practice. Forcing a naturally kinetic person to practice only seated meditation is like forcing a fish to climb a tree. It is not that the fish is defective. It is that the task is misaligned with its nature. Consider your own relationship with meditation or contemplative practice. If you have tried to meditate and found it frustrating or impossible, have you considered that perhaps the specific form you attempted was not suited to your constitution? There are dozens of legitimate meditation methods. Sitting is only one option. Some bodies need to move to meditate. Walking meditation, yoga, tai chi, qigong, or free movement meditation might serve these practitioners far better than forced stillness. Some minds need engagement to settle. Visualization practices, mantra repetition, or analytical meditation might work better than simple breath awareness. Some temperaments need devotional feeling. Practices involving gratitude, loving kindness, or connection to something greater might open doors that concentration practices leave closed. The trap Takeshi fell into is one that captures many sincere seekers. We see images of monks sitting in perfect lotus position, read descriptions of meditation as achieving mental silence, and conclude that if our experience does not match these ideals, we are failing. But these images and descriptions are not prescriptions for everyone. They are reports of particular approaches that worked for particular people. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck wrote, "Practice is not about achieving some special state. It is about learning to be with your life as it actually is rather than as you wish it would be." Takeshi learned to be with his kinetic nature rather than fighting to become still in a way that violated his basic constitution. This teaching extends far beyond meditation into every area of life. How often do you force yourself to work in ways that do not suit your natural rhythms? How frequently do you try to learn in styles that do not match your learning preferences? How consistently do you attempt to be social or solitary in ways that contradict your genuine needs? There is tremendous freedom in honoring your actual nature rather than trying to conform to some external standard of how you should be. This does not mean never challenging yourself or growing beyond current limitations, but it means working with your nature rather than against it, finding methods that harness your unique strengths rather than forcing you to operate from your weaknesses. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, notice if there is any way you are fighting against your natural state. Perhaps you are trying to fall asleep in a way that does not suit your body's needs. Perhaps you are judging yourself for thoughts and sensations that arise naturally. What if you could release that fight? What if you could trust that your own nature, when honored rather than controlled, knows how to find its own balance? The Buddha said, "No one saves us but ourselves. No one can, and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. Your path will not look like anyone else's path. The question is whether you have the courage to walk your unique path rather than trying to walk someone else's." In a modest training temple where young monks came to learn the fundamentals of Zen practice, there served a teacher named Genki, who was widely considered one of the most accomplished masters in the region. Students spoke with reverence about his deep wisdom, his impeccable mindfulness, and his ability to navigate every situation with perfect equanimity. Many believed that someone at his level of realization must have transcended the ordinary mistakes and confusions that plagued normal human beings. When a new group of students arrived for a 3-month intensive training period, they were thrilled to have the opportunity to study with such an enlightened teacher. They watched his every move, listened carefully to every word, and tried to emulate his example in their own practice. The first shock came during the second week of training. The community was gathered for the morning meal, eating in formal silence, as was the custom during intensive retreats. Genki was serving rice to the monks, moving down the line with a large serving ladle. When he reached a student named Hiroshi, the teacher somehow misjudged the distance and poured hot rice directly onto Hiroshi's hand instead of into his bowl. Hiroshi yelped in pain and surprise. Genki's eyes widened as he realized what he had done. "Oh no, I am so sorry," he exclaimed, immediately setting down the serving pot and examining Hiroshi's hand with concern. "I was not paying attention. Let me get cool water for this burn." The students watched in confusion as their supposedly perfected teacher rushed to care for the minor injury his carelessness had caused. How could an enlightened master make such a basic mistake? How could someone with his level of mindfulness fail to pay attention to something as simple as serving rice? The following week brought another surprise. During a lecture on the Heart Sutra, one of Buddhism's most fundamental texts, Genki was explaining a complex philosophical point when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, his face showing clear confusion. "I apologize," he said to the assembled students. "I have completely lost my train of thought." "What was I explaining?" A student tentatively raised her hand. "You were discussing emptiness in form, teacher." "Ah, yes, thank you," Genki replied, and continued his teaching. But the students exchanged uncertain glances. An awakened master who could lose his train of thought, who needed students to remind him what he had been teaching. The incidents continued. One morning, Genki arrived at meditation 15 minutes late, apologizing for oversleeping. During a work period, he picked up a rake he had just set down moments before. Having completely forgotten, he had already put it away. During a question and answer session, he admitted to a student that he did not know the answer to their question and would need to research it before responding. The students grew increasingly disillusioned. They had come expecting to study with a perfect master who would model flawless awareness and transcendent wisdom. Instead, they found themselves with a teacher who seemed almost comically prone to ordinary human errors and limitations. One evening, a group of students gathered in one of their rooms to discuss their concerns. A monk named Kenji expressed what many were thinking. "I do not understand. Master Genki is considered a great teacher, yet he makes mistakes constantly. He forgets things. He loses focus. He admits ignorance. How can someone who is supposedly enlightened be so imperfect?" An older student named Yuki, who had studied with Genki before, overheard their conversation and asked if she could join them. When they agreed, she sat down with a knowing smile. "Let me tell you a story," she began. 2 years ago, I was exactly where you are now. I came here expecting to find a perfect master who never made mistakes, and instead I found Genki, who seemed to make mistakes constantly. I was so disappointed that I considered leaving." "What changed?" asked Kenji. "I had a private meeting with Genki where I confronted him directly. I asked him how he could be considered an accomplished master when he seemed to lack even basic mindfulness. Do you know what he said?" The students leaned forward, eager to hear. "He told me that before he began serious practice, he made mistakes unconsciously and then defended them or pretended they did not happen. After some years of practice, he began to notice his mistakes, but still felt tremendous shame about them and tried to hide them. After more years of practice, he noticed his mistakes in the moment they happened and felt able to acknowledge them immediately without shame. And after even more practice, he realized that making mistakes was simply part of being human, and that true wisdom is not about becoming perfect, but about meeting imperfection with honesty, humility, and kindness." Yuki paused, letting her words settle. Then he said something I will never forget. He told me that students often project fantasies onto their teachers, imagining that awakening means becoming some kind of superhuman who never makes errors. But he said that such perfection is not the goal of Buddhist practice. The goal is to be fully human with clarity and compassion, to see clearly, respond skillfully when possible, acknowledge honestly when you make mistakes, and treat yourself and others with kindness throughout the messy, imperfect process of being alive. She looked around at the gathered students. Genki makes mistakes, yes. But notice what else he does. He acknowledges them immediately without defensiveness. He takes responsibility and makes amends. He does not pretend to know things he does not know. He does not hide his humanity behind a mask of spiritual perfection. This honesty, this humility, this willingness to be seen as imperfect, this is what makes him a genuine teacher, rather than just someone playing the role of a master. The students sat in silence, absorbing this different way of understanding their teacher. Kenji spoke slowly, working through a new understanding. "So, You are saying that his mistakes are not a contradiction to his realization, but somehow part of it. Exactly, Yuki confirmed. A teacher who pretends to be perfect is dangerous because they model an impossible standard and create shame in students who can never live up to that false image. But a teacher who is transparent about their ongoing humanity, who shows that awakening is compatible with making mistakes, such a teacher offers something far more valuable. They show that the path is accessible to real human beings rather than reserved for impossible ideals. Over the remaining weeks of the training period, the students began to watch Genki with new eyes. They noticed that while he made mistakes, he seemed to have no anxiety about making them. Where they would become defensive or ashamed when errors occurred, he simply acknowledged what happened and moved on. Where they would ruminate for hours about their failures, he learned what was useful from the situation and released what was not. More importantly, his transparency about his own imperfection created an atmosphere where students felt safe to be honest about their own struggles. Instead of pretending to have realizations they had not experienced or understanding they did not possess, they learned to say honestly, "I do not know," or "I made a mistake," or "I am confused." This honesty became the foundation for genuine learning rather than performance of spiritual achievement. At the end of the training period, during the closing ceremony, Kenji asked if he could address the group. With Genki's permission, he stood and spoke. "When I arrived here, I was looking for a perfect master who would show me how to become perfect. Instead, I found a human teacher who showed me how to be human with wisdom and grace. I wanted to learn how to make no mistakes. Instead, I learned how to make mistakes without shame, acknowledge them without defensiveness, and grow from them without self-punishment. This is a far more valuable teaching than the perfection I thought I wanted." Genki bowed deeply to his student. "Thank you for this teaching. You have understood something that took me many years to learn. The path is not about becoming something other than human. It is about being fully human with clear seeing and an open heart. The Buddha taught, 'There is no fire like passion, no shark like hatred, no snare like folly, no torrent like greed. It is easy to see the faults of others, but difficult to see one's own faults. One shows the faults of others like chaff winnowed in the wind, but one conceals one's own faults as a cunning gambler conceals his dice.' What emerges from this teaching is a profound insight about the danger of spiritual perfectionism and the liberation that comes from radical honesty about our ongoing humanity. Why do we create fantasies of perfect masters and impossible standards of realization? This pattern serves several psychological functions. First, it allows us to avoid the difficult work of actual practice by imagining that real transformation is reserved for rare superhuman beings rather than accessible to ordinary people like ourselves. If enlightenment requires perfection, we have a permanent excuse for why we have not achieved it. Second, belief in perfect masters allows us to remain in a dependent, childlike relationship to authority rather than stepping into the maturity of our own awakening. As long as the teacher is perfect and we are hopelessly flawed, we can keep seeking guidance rather than trusting our own direct experience. Third, perfectionist standards provide fuel for the harsh inner critic that many people carry. We use impossible ideals as weapons against ourselves, generating endless shame about our natural human limitations. Buddhist psychology recognizes what it calls the second arrow. The first arrow is the inevitable pain, difficulty, and imperfection of human existence. The second arrow is the suffering we add by judging, resisting, and being ashamed of the first arrow. We cannot avoid making mistakes, forgetting things, or experiencing confusion, but we can choose whether to compound these inevitable imperfections with shame and self-attack. Genki's teaching was not that mistakes do not matter, or that we should be careless. Rather, It was that mistakes can be met with clarity and kindness, rather than with defensive denial or crushing self-judgment. This transforms our relationship with imperfection from one of warfare to one of learning. Consider your own relationship with making mistakes. When you forget something important, do you berate yourself for hours? When you make an error at work, do you spiral into shame about your inadequacy? When you respond unskillfully in a relationship, do you defend and rationalize, or do you acknowledge what happened and make amends? The practice Genki modeled is sometimes called falling down 7 times, standing up 8. It is not about never falling. It is about the resilience, honesty, and self-compassion you bring to the inevitable falling that comes with being human. Zen teacher Pema Chodron writes, "The most fundamental aggression to ourselves is to remain ignorant by not having the courage and the respect to look at ourselves honestly and gently." Notice again those 2 words, honestly and gently. We need both. Honest seeing of our mistakes without gentle kindness becomes harsh judgment. Gentle kindness without honest seeing becomes denial and excuse-making. This teaching has profound implications for anyone in a teaching or leadership role, whether in spiritual contexts or secular ones. When leaders pretend to have achieved perfection, they create toxic cultures where followers must also pretend, where mistakes are hidden rather than learned from, and where shame becomes the dominant emotion. But when leaders model honest acknowledgement of mistakes, learning from them, and self-compassion in the face of imperfection, they create psychologically healthy environments where genuine growth becomes possible. Tonight, as you review your day, notice where mistakes arose. Perhaps you spoke sharply to someone you love. Perhaps you forgot an important task. Perhaps you acted in a way that does not align with your values. Can you meet these imperfections the way Genki met his? With immediate acknowledgement, without defensive spinning, with curiosity about what might be learned, and with kindness toward your imperfect humanity. The Buddha said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." This includes you as a mistake-making, forgetful, occasionally confused human being. Not someday when you have perfected yourself, but right now, exactly as you are. In a remote mountain monastery, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through dense forest and across several stream crossings, there lived a community of monks dedicated to intensive meditation practice. The monastery was famous for its long periods of silence. Practitioners would often go for weeks or even months without speaking, believing that verbal communication was a distraction from the deeper work of internal exploration. Among these silent practitioners was a teacher named Shunryu, who had not spoken a word in 3 years. His students communicated with him through written notes or silent gestures. He would nod or shake his head in response to questions, write brief instructions, or occasionally demonstrate through gesture what he meant. Despite his silence, or perhaps because of it, he was considered a powerful teacher whose very presence seemed to transmit something profound. One autumn, a new student arrived at the monastery. Her name was Ayame, and she had traveled from the city carrying tremendous grief. Her husband had died suddenly 6 months earlier, and despite trying various therapies and support groups, she remained trapped in overwhelming sorrow that seemed to be crushing her from within. She had heard that this monastery offered intensive retreat experiences and hoped that meditation might finally bring her some relief. When Ayame arrived, she was informed of the silence practice and enthusiastically embraced it. She was tired of talking about her grief, tired of well-meaning friends who offered explanations or tried to fix her pain with words, tired of her own mind endlessly narrating the story of her loss. Silence felt like a refuge. For the first 2 weeks, Ayame threw herself into the rigorous schedule. She sat in meditation for 8 hours daily, worked in silence in the garden, ate meals alone with her thoughts. But rather than finding relief, she discovered that without the distraction of conversation, Her grief became even more overwhelming. In the silence, memories of her husband would arise with crushing vividness. She would hear his voice, remember his touch, relive the moment she learned of his death, and be flooded with emotions so intense she felt she might drown. Several times she nearly left the monastery, but something kept her there. Perhaps it was having nowhere else to go. Perhaps it was a stubborn hope that if she just sat with the pain long enough, it would eventually dissolve. One morning during a meditation session, Ayame began to cry. Not quiet, dignified tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She tried to suppress the crying, ashamed to disturb the silence of the meditation hall, but the grief was too powerful. Her sobs echoed off the walls as years of held pain finally broke through her restraint. She expected to be asked to leave the hall, to take her disruptive emotions somewhere private. Instead, she felt someone sit down beside her. Opening her eyes, she saw that Shunryu had left his teaching seat and was now sitting on the floor next to her cushion. He did not speak. He did not put his arms around her or offer any physical comfort. He simply sat beside her, his presence solid and steady while she wept. His face showed no discomfort with her grief, no urge to make it stop, no judgment about her inability to maintain meditative composure. He just sat with her. After some time, Ayame's crying began to ease. She felt empty, wrung out, but somehow lighter. Shunryu remained beside her, still silent, still simply present. Then he did something unexpected. He began to cry as well. At first, Ayame thought she must be imagining it. But no, tears were definitely rolling down the old teacher's weathered cheeks. He was not sobbing as she had been, but quiet tears fell as he sat beside her. Still, he did not speak or explain. They sat together, two people crying side by side in the meditation hall, while the other practitioners continued their sitting around them. The silence was no longer empty or isolating. It felt full, alive, connected. After perhaps 20 minutes, Shunryu stood slowly, bowed to Ayame, and returned to his teaching seat. She remained on her cushion, feeling something she had not felt in 6 months. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of acceptance. A sense that her grief was not a problem to be solved or an emotion to be suppressed, but simply part of the landscape of human experience that could be met and held without being destroyed by it. Over the following weeks, something shifted in Ayame's relationship with her sorrow. She stopped fighting it or trying to meditate it away. Instead, she learned to sit with it, to feel it fully when it arose, and to trust that, like all experiences, it would change and eventually pass. The grief did not disappear, but it became more spacious somehow, no longer filling her entire consciousness, but existing alongside other experiences: joy, gratitude, simple peace. Near the end of her 3-month stay, Ayame requested a private meeting with Shunryu. They sat facing each other in the small interview room. Ayame bowed and spoke the first words she had said in weeks. "Teacher, I wanted to thank you for sitting with me when I was crying. Your presence helped me more than years of therapy and kind words from friends. But I have a question, if you are willing to break your silence to answer it. Why were you crying? Were you crying for me? For my loss?" For a long moment, Shunryu said nothing. Then he opened his mouth and spoke, his voice rough from disuse, but carrying tremendous warmth. "I was not crying for you. I was crying for myself. You see, 23 years ago, I lost my daughter. She was 7 years old and drowned in a river. The grief nearly destroyed me. For years, I raged against the universe, against the Buddha, against myself for not preventing her death. Eventually, I came to this monastery and buried myself in practice, hoping meditation would erase the pain." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. But grief does not disappear through spiritual bypassing. It only goes underground where it continues to poison everything. My 3 years of silence was not enlightened non-attachment. It was sophisticated avoidance. I stopped speaking because words might crack open the carefully sealed container where I had locked my sorrow. Ayame listened with her whole being, hardly breathing. When you began to cry that morning, Shunryu continued, your grief broke through my defenses. I felt my daughter's absence as freshly as if she had just died. And I realized that my elaborate spiritual practice had become a way of not feeling, not being human, not honoring my own love and loss. Your tears freed my tears. Your courage to feel gave me permission to feel. So, I was not crying for you. I was finally, after 23 years, crying for myself. He smiled gently. You came here hoping I would teach you how to transcend grief through meditation. Instead, you taught me that some things should not be transcended. Some losses are too sacred to be spiritualized away. The path is not about rising above our humanity, but about learning to be fully human with all the joy and sorrow that entails. Ayame bowed deeply, tears streaming down her face once again, but this time mixed with something like gratitude. Thank you for this teaching. It is the most valuable thing anyone has offered me since my husband died. After Ayame left the monastery, Shunryu ended his 3-year silence, not because he had achieved what he thought silence would bring, but because he realized that genuine presence sometimes requires words. That authentic connection sometimes means speaking. That real practice happens in relationship rather than isolation. The Buddha taught, health is the greatest possession, contentment is the greatest treasure, confidence is the greatest friend. But what the Buddha also understood was that health includes emotional health. Contentment comes from accepting reality rather than spiritualizing it away, and confidence means trusting your capacity to feel the full range of human experience without being destroyed by it. What emerges from this story is a teaching about the difference between spiritual practice and spiritual bypassing. Why do we sometimes use meditation and philosophy to avoid rather than engage with difficult emotions? Buddhist teacher John Welwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe the tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep unresolved psychological and emotional issues. This can look like using meditation to suppress feelings rather than process them, using non-attachment philosophy to avoid intimate relationships, or using ideas about emptiness to dismiss real pain. The paradox is that genuine spiritual practice ultimately requires us to feel more, not less, to become more sensitive, not more numb, to open to the full catastrophe of human existence rather than transcending into some emotional void. Shunryu's 3-year silence is an example of how even legitimate practices can become defense mechanisms. Silence can be a powerful tool for deepening awareness and stepping beyond the constant chatter of the thinking mind. But it can also become a way of not communicating, not being vulnerable, not risking the messy intimacy of genuine human connection. Contemporary trauma research reveals that unprocessed grief and loss do not simply disappear with time or spiritual practice. They get stored in the body, influencing physical health, emotional regulation, and capacity for connection. The path to healing runs through the pain, not around it. We must feel in order to heal. Consider your own relationship with difficult emotions. When grief, anger, fear, or hurt arise, what is your habitual response? Do you immediately try to meditate them away? Do you judge yourself for having such unspiritual feelings? Do you intellectualize them, analyzing their causes rather than actually feeling them? Do you distract yourself with activity, substances, or entertainment? Each of these strategies has its place as a short-term coping mechanism. But if they become our permanent approach to difficult emotions, we create what Buddhist psychology calls the near enemy of equanimity. True equanimity is the capacity to remain balanced while fully feeling whatever arises. The near enemy is emotional numbness, dressed up in spiritual language. Ayame's gift to Shunryo was her refusal to bypass her grief. By crying openly, by allowing her pain to be visible rather than hidden behind a meditation posture, she created permission for authentic feeling in a space that had become dedicated to sophisticated avoidance. The teaching here is not that we should always express every emotion we feel, or that emotional restraint is never appropriate. Rather, it is that we must be honest about the difference between skillful emotional regulation and avoidance disguised as spiritual practice. Zen teacher Pema Chodron writes, "The most fundamental aggression to ourselves is to remain ignorant by not having the courage to look at ourselves honestly and gently." Shunryu's 3-year silence was aggression against himself, dressed up as spiritual discipline. Only when confronted with Ayame's honest grief could he recognize this truth. Tonight, if there are any emotions you have been avoiding, any grief you have been trying to transcend, any feelings you have judged as too unspiritual to acknowledge, can you give yourself permission to simply feel? Not to indulge or dramatize, but to allow what is present to be fully present, held in the spacious awareness that is your deepest nature. The Buddha said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." This includes the parts of yourself that grieve, that hurt, that feel loss. These emotions are not obstacles to your practice. They are the very substance of it, calling you to bring compassionate awareness to the full range of human experience. In a prosperous valley where 3 monasteries stood within sight of each other, separated only by rice fields and winding paths, there arose a subtle competition that none of the monks would openly acknowledge. Each monastery had its own character and reputation. The Eastern Monastery was known for producing scholars who could debate the finest points of Buddhist philosophy. The Western Monastery was famous for its meditation masters who could sit in absorption for days. The Southern Monastery, where our story takes place, was smaller and less prestigious than its neighbors. A monk named Daichi lived in this Southern Monastery, and he suffered from a particular affliction that poisoned his practice daily. Every morning when he rose for meditation, he would look out the window toward the other monasteries and wonder what profound realizations were happening there. Every afternoon when he studied texts, he would imagine the brilliant insights being achieved by the scholars in the Eastern Monastery. Every evening when he sat in meditation, he would picture the deep states of concentration being attained by the masters in the Western Monastery. His own practice always seemed inadequate by comparison. Yes, he could meditate reasonably well, but surely not as deeply as those renowned masters across the valley. Yes, he understood the teachings adequately, but certainly not with the sophisticated precision of those celebrated scholars. His monastery's garden was pleasant, but not as elaborate as the famous gardens at the other locations. His teacher was kind and wise, but not as famous as the abbots who led the other communities. This constant comparison created a background hum of dissatisfaction that colored everything Daichi experienced. A perfectly good meditation session would be diminished by thoughts about how much better others were probably doing. A moment of genuine insight would be tainted by doubts about whether real scholars would consider it profound. Even moments of simple contentment would be interrupted by the nagging sense that he should be achieving more, becoming more, advancing faster. The monastery had a tradition of maintaining a small garden that each monk was assigned to tend for 1 month before rotating to a new assignment. When Daichi's turn came, he was given a neglected corner plot that previous monks had treated as unimportant. The soil was poor, rocks scattered throughout. A few struggling plants barely survived, and weeds dominated the space. Daichi's first instinct was disappointment. Why had he been given this inferior plot? The head gardener must have given the choice locations to more senior or more favored monks. This was just another example of how his experience here was less than what others received. But something unexpected happened as Daichi began working with this difficult plot. Unable to create anything immediately impressive, he had to focus simply on the basic work: removing rocks, amending soil, pulling weeds one by one, watering consistently. There was no point in comparing this garden to the elaborate displays at other monasteries. It was too humble for comparison. He could only work with what was actually in front of him. After a week of this simple, unglamorous labor, Daichi noticed tiny green shoots emerging where he had planted seeds. They were not impressive. Any gardener at the other monasteries could have grown better plants. But these were his. He had prepared the soil that nourished them. He had watered the earth that sustained them. He had removed the rocks that would have blocked them. Their growth was connected to his care in a direct, undeniable way. He found himself visiting the garden plot several times a day, checking on the seedlings with an attention he had never brought to his meditation practice. There was something deeply satisfying about this direct relationship. The plants did not care about gardens in other monasteries. They simply responded to the conditions he created. They grew or struggled based on what he actually did, not on what he wished he were doing or imagined others were doing. One morning, Daichi was watering his plants when the monastery's head teacher, an old woman named Aishin, came and stood watching him. He had not noticed her approach, so absorbed was he in his task. "Your garden is coming along nicely," she observed. Daichi glanced at his modest plot and then toward the monastery's main garden, which was far more developed. "It is nothing special. Just some basic vegetables and a few flowers. Nothing like the famous gardens at the eastern or western monasteries." Aishin raised an eyebrow. "Have you spent time in those gardens?" "Well, no. But I have heard about them. Everyone says they are magnificent." "I have visited them," Aishin said quietly. "They are indeed beautiful. But let me tell you something about those famous gardens. The Eastern Monastery's garden was designed by a landscape master they hired from the capital. It requires 3 full-time gardeners to maintain. The monks barely participate in its care. They walk through it appreciating its beauty, but they do not have the relationship with it that you have with your simple plot." She paused, looking at Daichi's emerging vegetables. The Western Monastery's garden is equally impressive, but it has become a source of competition and politics. Monks vie for the honor of being assigned to tend it. There is more concern about the garden's reputation than about actual care for living plants. Daichi felt something shift in his chest as he absorbed these words. "This garden," Aishin continued, gesturing to his humble plot, "is yours in a way those elaborate gardens can never belong to the monks who only admire them from a distance. You know every rock you removed. You feel the texture of the soil you amended. You recognize each seedling you planted. This direct relationship, this intimate engagement with what is actually in front of you. This is where genuine practice lives." She turned to face him directly. "You suffer because you are constantly comparing your experience to your fantasies about other people's experiences. But you are comparing your inner reality, which you know intimately with all its doubts and struggles, to other people's outer appearances, which you only see from a distance. This is like comparing your messy house to your neighbor's carefully staged photographs. It is not a fair or meaningful comparison." Over the following weeks, Daichi began to notice this pattern everywhere in his practice. During meditation, instead of being with his actual experience, he was comparing it to some imagined ideal of what meditation should feel like. During study, instead of engaging genuinely with the texts, he was worried about whether his understanding matched that of superior scholars. During every activity, part of his mind was comparing, evaluating, and usually finding himself lacking. He started to experiment with a different approach. When the comparing mind arose, he would gently acknowledge it and then return attention to direct experience. What did his body actually feel in this meditation? What insight was actually arising from this text? What was this moment's real taste, unfiltered by comparison to other moments? This shift was subtle, but profound. His meditation did not suddenly become dramatically deeper. His understanding did not transform overnight. His circumstances did not change, but his relationship with his own experience gradually transformed from one of constant judgment to one of simple presence. His garden month ended, but Daichi continued to visit his plot during free time. The vegetables he had planted began to produce food. The flowers he had nurtured began to bloom. Nothing spectacular, nothing that would impress visitors, but real growth resulting from real care. He would sit beside his plants sometimes, feeling a satisfaction that had nothing to do with comparison, nothing to do with being better than anyone else, and everything to do with genuine engagement with life. Years later, when students would come to Daichi for guidance, struggling with their own comparison suffering, he would take them to whatever garden plot he was tending at that time. "Look at this plant," he would say. "Does it wonder whether it is growing as magnificently as plants in other gardens? Does it torture itself with thoughts about superior plants elsewhere? It simply grows according to its nature, responding to available light and water and soil. Your practice is the same. Tend it with care. Work with the conditions you actually have. Stop comparing your insides to other people's outsides." The Buddha taught, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." This ancient wisdom points directly to the suffering that comparison creates and the liberation that comes from direct engagement with our actual experience. Why do we compulsively compare ourselves to others, especially in spiritual contexts where such comparison seems particularly inappropriate? Contemporary psychology identifies several factors that drive this pattern. First, we live in a culture saturated with comparison. Social media presents carefully curated highlights of other people's lives, creating the illusion that everyone else is happier, more successful, and more fulfilled than we are. We forget that we are comparing our full, messy reality to other people's edited presentations. Second, comparison gives the ego something to do. The sense of separate self is maintained through constant evaluation and judgment. Am I ahead or behind? Am I succeeding or failing? This mental activity, though painful, reinforces the feeling of being a distinct individual navigating a competitive world. Third, comparison allows us to avoid direct engagement with our actual experience. It is easier to fantasize about what practice would be like if we were more talented, had better circumstances, or studied with superior teachers than it is to work honestly with what is actually present. Buddhist psychology recognizes this pattern as a fundamental obstacle to awakening. The Pali term is papanka, often translated as proliferation or elaboration. It refers to the mind's tendency to spin elaborate narratives rather than meeting experience directly. Comparison is one of the primary forms this proliferation takes. The suffering of comparison is particularly insidious because it poisons even genuine success. When Daichi's vegetables grew, he could not simply enjoy them because his mind immediately compared them to superior vegetables elsewhere. When he had insight during meditation, he could not appreciate it because he worried whether real masters would consider it profound. Nothing he experienced could be satisfactory because satisfaction requires accepting what is, and comparison prevents that acceptance. Consider your own patterns of comparison. In what domains do you constantly measure yourself against others? Perhaps it is professional achievement, where you track yourself against colleagues and feel either smug superiority or anxious inadequacy depending on the comparison. Perhaps it is physical appearance, where you judge your body against cultural ideals and find yourself wanting. Perhaps it is spiritual development, where you imagine that others have achieved states of peace and realization that elude you. Notice what comparison does to your experience. Does it increase or decrease your satisfaction? Does it motivate genuine growth or simply create anxiety? Does it lead to authentic improvement or merely to performance and pretense? The teaching here is not that we should never assess our progress or learn from others who are more skilled. Appropriate evaluation and learning from examples are valuable aspects of growth. The problem arises when comparison becomes a constant background process that prevents direct engagement with present experience. Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." The beginner's mind that Suzuki praised is partly characterized by its freedom from comparison. A true beginner does not yet know what expert performance looks like, so they can engage fully with their actual experience without the overlay of judgment and comparison. Daichi's breakthrough came through working with his humble garden plot. Because it was too modest to compare favorably with famous gardens elsewhere, he was forced to drop comparison and simply engage. The plants responded to his actual care, not to his thoughts about how his care compared to other gardeners' care. This direct relationship between action and result taught him something that years of meditation had not. The practice suggested by this story is what we might call radical localism in attention. Instead of letting your mind wander to other people's experiences, other possible circumstances, or imagined alternatives, can you bring attention fully to what is actually here? This specific breath, this particular thought, this exact sensation, not as it compares to other moments, but as it is in itself. This does not mean we become so focused on ourselves that we ignore others or stop learning from examples. Rather, it means we learn from others through direct engagement rather than through comparison. We observe what others do, extract useful insights, and apply them to our own practice without the overlay of judgment about whether we measure up. Tonight, as you settle into rest, notice if comparison arises. Perhaps you compare how quickly you fall asleep to other nights. Perhaps you judge whether you are relaxing correctly compared to some ideal. Can you gently release these comparisons and simply be with your actual experience? Can you tend the garden of this moment with the same care Daichi brought to his modest plot, not worrying about gardens elsewhere, but simply working with the soil you have? The Buddha said, "Do not dwell in the past. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment." We might add, do not dwell in fantasy gardens you have never visited. Do not dream of being someone you are not. Concentrate care on the actual garden you have been given to tend. This is where real growth happens. This is where genuine peace is found. In a teaching monastery, where young monks came to study with experienced masters, there arrived a student named Kenzo, whose mind was like a machine that generated questions constantly. From the moment he woke until he lay down to sleep, his thoughts spun endlessly, analyzing, wondering, questioning every aspect of the teachings and his experience. During Dharma talks, while other students listened quietly and absorbed the teachings, Kenzo's hand would shoot up repeatedly. "But Master, if all things are impermanent, does that mean impermanence itself is impermanent? And if the self is an illusion, who is it that realizes the self is an illusion? And how can we practice non-attachment when the desire to be non-attached is itself an attachment?" His questions were not foolish. In fact, they were often quite sophisticated, demonstrating a sharp intellect and genuine engagement with philosophical paradoxes. The teachers would answer patiently, offering responses drawn from centuries of Buddhist reasoning. But Kenzo's questions never seemed to be satisfied. Each answer spawned 3 new questions. Each explanation revealed new angles to wonder about. His mind was insatiable in its appetite for understanding. The other students began to find Kenzo's constant questioning disruptive. Dharma talks would run far over time because the teacher had to address his numerous inquiries. Meditation sessions would be followed by Kenzo cornering the teacher with more questions before anyone else could speak. Even casual conversations would be hijacked by his need to analyze and understand every dimension of every topic. What troubled Kenzo most was a particular paradox at the heart of Zen teaching. The master spoke of a truth that could not be conveyed in words, a realization that must be directly experienced rather than intellectually understood. But if truth could not be expressed in language, why were there thousands of texts and endless teachings? If enlightenment was beyond concepts, why did they spend so much time discussing concepts? Kenzo approached the head teacher, a stern elderly master named Bankei, with this very question. Master, you tell us that awakening cannot be transmitted through words, yet you speak to us for hours each week. You say the ultimate truth is beyond intellectual understanding, yet you encourage us to study texts and engage in philosophical discussion. How do you explain this contradiction? Bankei looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement, or might have been pity. Tell me, Kenzo, when you eat your meals, does the food nourish you? Of course, Kenzo replied, wondering where this was heading. And when you think about food, analyze its nutritional content and discuss culinary philosophy. Does that nourish you? Well, no, but thinking about food helps me understand what to eat and how to prepare it properly. Indeed, Bankei nodded. And your questions about practice are similar. They are like thinking about food. Useful perhaps in small doses for choosing what to eat, but if you spend all your time thinking about food and never actually eating, you will starve regardless of how sophisticated your understanding of nutrition becomes. Kenzo felt frustrated by this response. But Master, I do practice. I meditate daily. I follow all the forms and rituals, yet I still do not understand. My mind is full of questions that have not been answered. Your mind is full of questions that cannot be answered, Bankei corrected gently. Not because the answers are secret or hidden, but because the questions themselves arise from a fundamental confusion. You are trying to use the thinking mind to understand something that is prior to thinking. This is like trying to use a knife to cut itself. He stood and walked to a window overlooking the garden. Come here, he instructed. Kenzo joined him at the window. Do you see that bird in the tree? Yes, I see a sparrow on the maple branch. When that bird needs to fly, does it first analyze the aerodynamics of wing movement? Does it question whether flight is truly possible or merely an illusion? Does it wonder about the nature of the air that supports it? No, it just flies. Exactly. It acts from its nature directly, without the intervention of questioning mind. This is what we call natural functioning. You, Kenzo, are so busy questioning everything that you never act from your nature. You never simply fly. Over the following weeks, Bankei gave Kenzo a specific assignment. Each day, Kenzo was to sit in the garden for 1 hour with strict instructions. He could not read. He could not write. He could not analyze or question. If questions arose in his mind, he was to simply notice them and let them be without trying to answer them or develop them further. He was to sit and observe whatever arose without the commentary of questioning mind. The first days were torture for Kenzo. His mind rebelled against the restriction. Questions would arise, and the urge to pursue them was almost overwhelming. Without the usual outlets for his mental energy, he felt anxious, agitated, uncomfortable. He would watch birds, clouds, leaves moving in wind, but his mind wanted to turn everything into questions. Why do clouds form those shapes? What makes leaves move that particular way? What is the purpose of birdsong? But gradually, something began to shift. After perhaps 10 days of this practice, Kenzo noticed brief moments where he would see something without immediately questioning it. A butterfly would land on a flower, and for just a second, there would be simple seeing without the question-generating machine engaging. A breeze would touch his face, and there would be pure sensation before thought commentary began. These gaps were brief at first, lasting only moments before the questioning mind reasserted itself. But Kenzo noticed that in those gaps, there was a quality of peace he had never experienced in his elaborate intellectual understanding. The questions that usually filled his mind suddenly seemed less urgent, less real. They were revealed as voluntary mental activity rather than necessary responses to reality. One afternoon during his garden sitting, a monk walked by carrying a bucket of water. Some water sloshed over the edge and splashed onto the ground near Kenzo's feet. For a moment, there was simply splash, the sound, the sight, the fresh wetness on stone. And in that moment, Kenzo suddenly understood what Benkei had been pointing to. The understanding was not an answer to any of his questions. It was more like the questions themselves dissolved, revealed to be based on false premises. He saw that he had been like someone asking elaborate questions about the water in a mirage, never recognizing that there was no water to analyze. The thinking mind that generated endless questions was itself the veil that obscured direct experience. Kenzo sat very still, tears streaming down his face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. After years of restless questioning, there was finally just this. Just sitting, just breathing, just being, without the exhausting overlay of questions demanding answers. When the hour ended, Kenzo went to find Benkei. The old master was sweeping leaves from a walkway. Kenzo bowed deeply and said simply, "Thank you." Benkei smiled without stopping his sweeping. "So, you have eaten at last instead of just reading the menu? Good. But do not mistake one taste for the end of practice. You have glimpsed something true. Now the real work begins, learning to live from that glimpse rather than falling back into the questioning mind." Over the months and years that followed, Kenzo's relationship with questions transformed completely. He still had thoughts and wondered about things, but the questions no longer had the same compulsive quality. They were lighter, more playful, less urgent. He could let them come and go without needing to resolve every uncertainty. More importantly, he developed the capacity to act directly from his nature, responding to situations with spontaneous appropriateness rather than through the filter of constant analysis. When new students would arrive at the monastery full of questions, Kenzo would sometimes tell them about his own journey. "Questions are not bad," he would say, "but they are like seasoning in food. A little enhances the meal, but if you eat only seasoning, you will miss the nourishment. Learn to taste life directly, and your questions will find their proper place." The Buddha taught, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." What emerges from this teaching is insight into the relationship between intellectual understanding and direct realization. Why do we become trapped in endless questioning and analysis, especially regarding spiritual matters? This pattern serves several functions. First, the questioning mind creates the illusion of progress. As long as we are pursuing answers, we feel we are moving toward understanding. This is comforting, even when the movement is circular, leading nowhere. Second, questioning keeps us at a safe distance from direct experience. It is less threatening to analyze life than to fully feel it, less risky to question truth than to stake everything on living it. The thinking mind, for all its apparent seeking, is actually an elaborate defense against the vulnerability of direct encounter with reality. Third, our culture conditions us to believe that intellectual understanding is the highest form of knowledge. We are taught that every question has an answer, every mystery can be solved through sufficient analysis. This creates tremendous discomfort with not knowing, with uncertainty, with the recognition that some dimensions of experience are prior to conceptual thought. Buddhist philosophy makes a crucial distinction between relative truth and absolute truth. Relative truth operates in the domain of concepts, language, and analysis. Here, questions and answers are appropriate and useful. We need to think clearly about ethical conduct, understand cause and effect, and analyze our experience skillfully. But absolute truth points to what is prior to all concepts, the direct nature of awareness itself. Here, questions are like trying to catch wind in a jar. The very attempt misses the point, because wind is not something you can contain in concepts. Kenzo's suffering came from trying to use conceptual questions to grasp non-conceptual truth. This is the classic error that Zen is designed to address. The koans, paradoxical questions like, what is the sound of one hand clapping, are not riddles to be solved through clever thinking. They are designed to exhaust the questioning mind, to demonstrate its limits, and to point beyond it to direct seeing. Consider your own relationship with questions and uncertainty. How comfortable are you with not knowing? When you encounter mystery or paradox, is your immediate response to analyze and figure it out? How much of your mental energy goes into trying to understand life rather than simply living it? The teaching here is not that we should abandon critical thinking or stop asking questions entirely. Rather, it is that we must recognize the proper domain and limits of conceptual thought. Some aspects of existence can be understood through analysis. Others can only be known through direct participation. Zen teacher Alan Watts wrote, "Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. The self that you are trying to understand through questions is the same self doing the questioning. This creates an impossible loop that can never resolve through more thinking." The practice Benkei prescribed for Kenzo, sitting without engaging questions, is sometimes called just sitting, or shikantaza in Zen. It is not about achieving any particular state or having any special experience. It is simply the practice of being present without adding commentary, letting experience be as it is without the overlay of questioning mind. This does not mean questions never arise. They will. The practice is to notice them and let them be without feeling compelled to pursue them or answer them. Like clouds passing through the sky, thoughts and questions can move through awareness without needing to be captured or resolved. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, notice what happens if you stop questioning your experience. Instead of asking, "Am I relaxing correctly?" or "Why can't I fall asleep?" or "What is the meaning of this thought?" What if you simply let experience be as it is? Can you taste the difference between questioning mind and simple presence? The Buddha said, "Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, not even if I have said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense." But he also taught that there is a knowing beyond reason, a wisdom that arises from direct experience rather than from analysis. The challenge is learning when to think and when to simply be, when to question and when to rest in direct seeing. High in the mountains where snow remained even in summer months, and the air was so thin that newcomers would gasp for breath until their bodies adjusted, there stood a monastery famous for the rigor of its training program. Young monks who came there would spend years in intensive preparation, learning forms and rituals, studying texts and commentaries, practicing meditation techniques and physical disciplines, all designed to make them ready for what was called true practice. A monk named Hiroki had been at this monastery for 7 years, working through the elaborate training program with dedicated persistence. He had mastered the basic meditation forms and was now working on advanced techniques. He had memorized hundreds of sutras and was now studying obscure commentaries. He had learned the correct way to bow, walk, sit, eat, and perform every daily activity according to tradition. His teachers consistently told him he was making excellent progress and should continue his preparation diligently. But something troubled Hiroki. He noticed that the senior monks, those who had been there for 20 or 30 years and had completed even more preparation than he had, did not seem particularly awakened or peaceful. They were tremendously skilled at performing rituals and could recite texts flawlessly. They sat in perfect meditation posture and moved through their days with choreographed precision. But they also seemed tense, competitive, and frequently concerned about minor rule violations and proper forms. One day, Hiroki had an opportunity to travel with his teacher to a nearby village to accept offerings from lay supporters. On the way back, they passed a small hermitage where a monk who had left their monastery years ago was said to live. Hiroki's teacher spoke of this monk, whose name was Teshu, with obvious disdain. He gave up on proper training, the teacher explained. After only 3 years of preparation, he decided he knew better than centuries of tradition and left to live alone. He probably sits up there believing he has achieved something when he has barely scratched the surface of real practice. But Hiroki was curious. As they passed the path leading to the hermitage, he asked if they might stop briefly to pay respects. His teacher reluctantly agreed, clearly expecting to demonstrate the poverty of Teshu's development compared to their monastery's excellence. When they arrived at the simple hut, Teshu welcomed them with warm hospitality, offering tea and rice crackers. He moved with an ease and natural grace that Hiroki found striking. Where the monks in Hiroki's monastery always seemed to be performing correct movement consciously, Teshu simply moved appropriately without apparent self-consciousness. As they drank tea, Hiroki's teacher began to subtly interrogate Teshu about his practice. "Tell me, do you still maintain the triple prostration sequence before meditation? Do you recite the Heart Sutra daily? Have you completed the study of the Abhidharma?" Teshu smiled gently. "I bow when bowing feels like the natural expression of reverence. I recite sutras when those words resonate with present experience. I study teachings when study serves awakening rather than accumulation." The teacher's face showed clear disapproval. "So, you have abandoned proper form in favor of..." "What? Simply doing whatever you feel like doing? This is spiritual laziness dressed up as spontaneity." "Perhaps," Teshu acknowledged without defensiveness, "or perhaps proper form can become spiritual avoidance dressed up as preparation. Tell me, after all your years of training, all your elaborate preparation, when do you plan to actually wake up? Or is preparation itself the point?" The teacher stood abruptly, offended. "We should go. I can see there is nothing to learn here from someone who abandoned the path." But Hiroki found himself unable to leave without asking a question that had been forming in his mind. "Teshu, if I may ask, why did you leave the monastery? What made you decide to stop preparing and start whatever it is you were doing here?" Teshu's eyes showed understanding and compassion. "I realized I was becoming extremely skilled at getting ready to live, but never actually living. I could bow perfectly, but rarely felt genuine reverence. I could recite texts flawlessly, but was not applying their teachings. I could sit in meditation for hours, but was not transforming how I engaged with life. All my preparation was becoming a substitute for practice rather than a foundation for it." He paused, looking directly at Hiroki. "One morning, I was performing the elaborate breakfast ritual we had been taught, each gesture precisely executed, each moment choreographed, and I suddenly understood that I was so focused on doing it correctly that I was not actually tasting my food, not actually grateful for the nourishment, not actually present to the simple act of eating. All my spiritual training had made me less present rather than more present." Hiroki felt those words land in his chest with the weight of recognition. He thought about his own practice, how much energy went into correct form, and how little into actual engagement with life. "So, what did you do?" Hiroki asked. "I left. I found this hut, and I began very simply to practice being present for each moment, without the overlay of constant concern about whether I was doing it correctly according to some external standard. I made many mistakes. I still do. But my mistakes are authentic engagements with life rather than perfect performances of someone else's choreography." On the walk back to the monastery, Hiroki's teacher ranted about Teshu's arrogance and the dangers of abandoning proper training. But Hiroki barely heard him. His mind was working through a recognition that was both liberating and terrifying. That evening, after meditation, Hiroki requested a private interview with the abbot, the head of the entire monastery. The abbot was an elderly man who had been at the monastery for over 50 years, having worked through every level of training and now overseeing others' preparation. "Abbot," Hiroki began carefully, "I have been here for 7 years, working through the training program diligently. I am told I am making good progress, but I must ask you honestly, when does preparation end and actual practice begin? When am I ready to wake up?" The abbot smiled in a way that Hiroki found patronizing. "You are not yet ready, Hiroki. You have completed only basic and intermediate levels. There are advanced levels to master, then senior levels beyond those. Perhaps in another 15 or 20 years, if you continue to progress well, you might be ready for true practice." "But abbot," Hiroki pressed, feeling bold from his encounter with Teshu, "you have been here 50 years. Have you awakened? Has all that preparation led to realization?" The abbot's smile vanished, replaced by stern disapproval. "That is an improper question. A student does not interrogate his teacher's attainment, return to your preparation, and trust the process." That night, Hiroki could not sleep. He lay on his sleeping mat, reviewing his 7 years at the monastery. He had learned so much, mastered so many techniques, absorbed so many teachings. But had he actually transformed? Had all this preparation made him kinder, wiser, more free? Or had it simply made him better at performing the appearance of spiritual development? By morning, Hiroki had made his decision. He would leave, not because the monastery was wrong or bad, but because he recognized that for him, continued preparation was becoming an obstacle rather than a support. He needed to discover whether he could actually practice rather than endlessly get ready to practice. When he informed his teacher of his decision, the response was predictable. "You are making a terrible mistake. You are nowhere near ready. Without proper preparation, you will fail and waste all the years you have invested here." But Hiroki had glimpsed something through Teshu's example. Life itself was the practice field. Each moment was an opportunity to wake up. Preparation was useful only insofar as it supported actual engagement with present experience. Beyond that point, it became sophisticated avoidance. Hiroki left the monastery and found a simple hut in the valley. He continued to meditate, but now meditation was not preparation for some future awakening. It was itself practice, complete in each moment. He continued to study, but now study was not accumulation of knowledge for later use. It was direct investigation of present experience. Most importantly, he stopped dividing his life into spiritual preparation and ordinary activity. Cooking became practice, walking became practice, conversations became practice. Everything became an opportunity to be present rather than to get ready to be present someday. Years later, when students would find their way to Hiroki seeking teaching, he would tell them, "If you want to learn to swim, at some point you must get in the water. You can study swimming techniques for decades, but until you actually enter the water, you have not begun." Spiritual practice is the same. Preparation has its place, but do not mistake preparation for the practice itself. Life is happening now. Are you present for it? Or are you getting ready to be present someday? The Buddha taught, "There are 2 mistakes one can make along the road to truth, not going all the way and not starting." What emerges from this teaching is recognition of how preparation can become an obstacle disguised as a path. Why do we become trapped in perpetual preparation, always getting ready, but never quite beginning? This pattern serves several psychological functions. First, preparation feels safe. As long as we are still preparing, we cannot fail at the actual task. We can maintain the fantasy that once we are properly ready, we will succeed brilliantly. Beginning exposes us to the possibility of failure, of discovering our limitations, of struggling with real challenges rather than imagined ones. Second, preparation creates a sense of progress without requiring actual transformation. We can accumulate knowledge, skills, and credentials while our fundamental character remains unchanged. This is comfortable because real transformation is difficult and requires confronting aspects of ourselves we would prefer to avoid. Third, preparation allows us to avoid the vulnerability of genuine engagement with life. It is less risky to practice perfect meditation in a controlled monastery setting than to bring awareness to messy real-world relationships. It is easier to study texts about compassion than to actually feel compassion for difficult people. It is more comfortable to prepare for awakening than to wake up. Contemporary psychology recognizes this pattern in many domains. Students who take course after course but never begin their actual career. Writers who read endlessly about writing but never actually write. People who prepare for relationships through therapy and self-help but never risk actual intimacy. The pattern is the same, using preparation as a sophisticated form of avoidance. Consider your own life. Where might you be trapped in perpetual preparation? Perhaps you are always getting ready to start that project, waiting until conditions are perfect. Perhaps you are constantly learning new techniques for meditation or personal growth, but never actually applying anything consistently. Perhaps you are preparing for a life change you intend to make someday when you feel ready. The uncomfortable truth is that we are never completely ready. Life does not wait for perfect preparation. Every moment is the only moment we actually have to work with. This does not mean preparation is useless or that we should act impulsively without developing skills and knowledge. The teaching is about finding the balance point where preparation becomes support rather than substitute, where it enhances practice rather than replacing it. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi said, "The most important thing is to find out what is the most important thing." For Teshu, and eventually for Hiroki, the most important thing was actual present moment engagement with life rather than perfect performance of formal practices. The monastery's error was not in offering structured training, it was in creating the implicit belief that enough preparation would somehow make awakening automatic, that by perfecting forms, you would eventually perfect consciousness. But awakening does not work that way. It is available in this moment or not at all. No amount of preparation makes you ready for now, because now is always already here. Tonight, as you lie preparing for sleep, notice if there are ways you might be preparing to rest, rather than actually resting. Are you trying to get your mind perfectly quiet before you allow yourself to sleep? Are you waiting for conditions to be just right before you let go? What would it mean to stop preparing and simply rest now, exactly as you are, with whatever noise or discomfort or thought activity is present? The Buddha said, "The trouble is, you think you have time." We postpone living until we feel ready, until we are more prepared, until conditions are better. But life is only ever happening now. The question is whether we will finally begin or spend our entire existence getting ready to begin someday. In a valley monastery, where cherry trees bloomed each spring and turned gold each autumn, there lived a young monk named Sato who had developed what he considered a sophisticated meditation practice. He had learned to achieve states of deep concentration, where his mind became very quiet and still. He could enter these states almost at will during his formal sitting practice, and he found them profoundly peaceful and satisfying. Sato began to believe that maintaining this quiet, concentrated state was the goal of practice. He became skilled at controlling his environment to support his meditation. He preferred to sit in the quietest corner of the meditation hall. He would become irritated if other monks coughed or shifted position during sitting periods. He avoided work assignments that were too physically demanding because they made his mind too active. He carefully regulated his schedule to maximize time in his preferred meditative states. One spring, the monastery was preparing to host a large gathering for the Buddha's birthday celebration. Monks from many temples would visit. Lay supporters would come to make offerings, and there would be ceremonies, teachings, and communal meals extending over 3 days. The abbot assigned Sato to be part of the team managing the outdoor arrangements, setting up tents and seating areas in the monastery courtyard. Sato was deeply unhappy with this assignment. It would disrupt his practice schedule completely. He would be too busy and too physically exhausted to maintain his meditation states. He petitioned the abbot to be given a different role, something quiet, like managing the library or organizing the altar. But the abbot, a woman named Sikin, who had led the monastery for many years, refused his request. "This assignment is exactly what your practice needs right now," she said simply, offering no further explanation despite Sato's protests. The preparation period was indeed as disruptive as Sato had feared. He spent long days hauling equipment, constructing temporary structures, coordinating with other workers. His body ached. His mind was too stimulated and active to settle into his preferred concentrated states. His carefully maintained practice routine was completely demolished. He felt resentful and convinced that this work was taking him away from real practice. Each evening, exhausted, he would try to meditate and find his mind too turbulent to achieve the quiet states he valued. He began to feel that he was regressing, losing ground he had worked years to gain. On the morning of the celebration's first day, Sato woke before dawn to dark clouds and the sound of rain beginning to fall. His heart sank. They had prepared everything for outdoor ceremonies. If it rained hard, all their work would be undermined. Worse, the weather would create chaos, mud, and general disorder that would make the next 3 days miserable. As the rain increased from a gentle patter to a steady downpour, Sato felt his stress and frustration mounting. This was exactly the kind of situation he had learned to avoid in his practice. Uncontrollable, unpleasant circumstances that disturbed his carefully maintained equilibrium. He found Abbot Sikin standing on the covered walkway, looking out at the rain with a peaceful expression. "It is raining quite hard," Sato said, unable to keep the distress from his voice. "All our outdoor preparations are ruined. The celebration will be a disaster." Seiken turned to look at him with gentle eyes. "It is raining," she agreed. "What disaster do you see? Everything will be muddy and wet. People will be uncomfortable. The ceremonies will have to be moved indoors where there is not enough space. Nothing will go according to plan." "Ah," Seiken nodded. "So, your disaster is that reality does not match your plan. Tell me, Sato, in your meditation practice, have you been trying to make reality match your plan for how your mind should be?" The question struck Sato like a physical blow. He suddenly saw how his entire approach to practice had been about control, about creating conditions that matched his preferences, about achieving states he considered valuable and avoiding states he considered obstacles. "Come with me," Seiken said, stepping out into the rain without taking an umbrella. Sato hesitated, then followed. The rain was cold and heavy, soaking through his robes within seconds. They walked to the middle of the courtyard where the preparations stood partially dismantled by the weather. "Feel this rain," Seiken said, her voice carrying clearly despite the sound of falling water. "Really feel it. Not your thoughts about the rain or your resistance to being wet. Just the direct sensation of rain on your skin, the sound of rain on stone, the smell of rain in the air." Sato stopped trying to shrink away from the wetness and instead opened his awareness to the actual experience. The rain was cold, yes, but there was something vital and alive in that coldness. The sound was not an irritating disruption, but a kind of rhythm, thousands of drops creating a symphony of percussion. The smell was fresh, earthy, clean. Your practice has been about creating a protected bubble, Sikin continued, where everything is controlled and predictable. You have mistaken this bubble for awakening. But real practice is about meeting life exactly as it is, whether it matches your preferences or not. The rain does not care about your plans. The rain simply rains. Can you simply be here with the rain? They stood in silence for several minutes, rain pouring down on them both. Sato felt something beginning to shift in his chest. His usual resistance to unpleasant conditions was still there, but for the first time he could feel it as a choice he was making rather than as an automatic response. He could feel the tightness in his body that came from fighting against what was happening, and he could feel how that tightness created suffering beyond the simple physical sensation of cold and wetness. What if he stopped fighting? What if he simply let himself be cold and wet without adding the story about how this was wrong or bad? The moment he released that resistance, something remarkable happened. The rain was still cold. His body was still uncomfortable, but there was a quality of peace underneath the discomfort, a spacious awareness that could hold the experience without being overwhelmed by it. This is practice, Sikin said softly. Not achieving special states and perfect conditions, but meeting each moment with openness, regardless of whether that moment is pleasant or unpleasant, whether it matches your plan or disrupts it completely. Over the next 3 days, the celebration proceeded in ways Sato never could have planned. The outdoor ceremonies were moved to partially covered areas. People huddled together under temporary shelters, creating an unexpected intimacy. The rain eventually stopped, but everything was muddy and improvised. Nothing was neat or controlled. Yet Sato found himself more present than he had been in months of carefully controlled practice. Each moment required fresh response rather than following familiar patterns. There was no possibility of creating his preferred conditions, so he had to work with whatever was actually present. And in that direct engagement with uncontrolled reality, he discovered a quality of aliveness and authenticity that his controlled practice had been missing. During a break between ceremonies, a young visitor from another temple approached Sato with a question. "I have been watching you work these past days. Even in all this chaos and difficulty, you seem very peaceful. What is your secret?" Sato laughed, remembering how stressed and resentful he had felt just days before. "I have no secret. I am simply learning to get rained on without complaining about the rain." The visitor looked confused, clearly hoping for more profound teaching. But Sato realized he had spoken a truth more profound than any philosophical explanation could convey. The rain falls. We can resist it and create suffering, or we can open to it and discover that we are large enough to contain even difficult experiences without being destroyed by them. After the celebration ended and the visitors departed, Sato requested a meeting with Abbot Sikin. "Thank you for this teaching," he said, bowing deeply. "I understand now that I was not really practicing. I was constructing a pleasant prison and calling it peace." Sikin smiled warmly. "Your meditation skills are valuable, Sato. The concentration you developed is real and useful, but it was beginning to become a hiding place rather than a training ground. Now you can bring that same quality of attention to all of life, not just to controlled conditions in the meditation hall. This is when practice becomes complete." From that time forward, Sato's practice transformed. He still sat in formal meditation, but he no longer clung to particular states or became frustrated when his mind was active rather than quiet. He no longer avoided challenging work assignments or difficult conditions. He discovered that every situation, pleasant or unpleasant, was an opportunity to practice meeting life with openness. Years later, when teaching students, Sato would often tell them, "You can spend your whole life trying to eliminate rain from your experience, or you can learn to dance in the rain. One leads to endless frustration. The other leads to freedom. The Buddha taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your own salvation with diligence. What emerges from this teaching is the recognition that spiritual practice is not about creating permanent, pleasant conditions, but about transforming our relationship with the inevitable changes and challenges of existence. Why do we believe that peace requires perfect conditions? This misconception has roots in our natural tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain. We imagine that if we could just arrange circumstances correctly, maintain the right schedule, avoid difficult people and situations, we would finally find lasting contentment. But Buddhist wisdom points to a different understanding. Peace that depends on conditions remaining favorable is fragile and temporary. Real peace comes from developing the capacity to remain centered regardless of what is happening externally. This is sometimes called unconditional happiness, not because we are happy about everything that occurs, but because our fundamental well-being is not conditional upon favorable circumstances. Sato's error was confusing meditation states with awakening itself. The concentrated quiet states he valued are indeed pleasant and useful. They can develop mental stability and provide respite from mental turbulence. But if we become attached to these states, believing they are the goal, we miss the deeper purpose of practice. The goal is not to achieve special states, but to transform how we relate to all states. Can we be present for pleasant experiences without clinging to them? Can we be present for unpleasant experiences without being overwhelmed? Can we meet the constantly changing flow of life with flexibility and openness? This teaching applies far beyond formal meditation practice. In every area of life, we can become trapped in trying to control conditions rather than developing the capacity to meet whatever arises. We try to control our relationships so they never challenge us. We try to control our careers so they always feel satisfying. We try to control our bodies so they never experience pain or illness. All of this controlling creates tremendous stress and ultimately fails because conditions are inherently uncontrollable. Consider your own life right now in this moment. What conditions are you resisting? Perhaps you are uncomfortable physically, but believing you should not be. Perhaps you are hearing sounds you wish would stop. Perhaps you are having thoughts you judge as wrong or inappropriate. All this resistance adds a layer of suffering beyond the actual experience itself. Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki said, "These mountains and rivers and great earth are all the teachings of the Buddha." Everything that arises in experience is teaching us something if we can meet it with openness rather than resistance. The rain that disrupted Sato's plans taught him more than years of controlled meditation practice. The practice of acceptance does not mean passivity or resignation. We can still work to change conditions, take care of ourselves, and make choices that support well-being. But we do so from a place of acceptance of what actually is, rather than from resistance to reality. This changes everything about how we engage with life. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, notice what you might be resisting about this moment. Perhaps your body is not perfectly comfortable. Perhaps your mind is more active than you would prefer. Perhaps you are not falling asleep as quickly as you think you should. Can you stop fighting against these conditions and simply let them be as they are? Can you discover that you are spacious enough to contain even uncomfortable experiences without being diminished by them? The Buddha said, "Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. The rain will fall. Conditions will frequently not match our preferences. This is inevitable. But whether we create suffering through resistance or find peace through acceptance, this is optional. And this is where our real freedom lives." As we arrive at the end of this journey through ancient monastery tales, take a moment to notice where you are now. Perhaps your body has settled into deeper relaxation than when we began. Perhaps your breath has naturally slowed and softened. Perhaps the concerns that filled your mind hours ago have receded like evening shadows, leaving space for something quieter to emerge. These stories we have shared tonight are not entertainment for your thinking mind. They are medicine for your spirit, keys that unlock doors you did not know were closed, invitations to recognize truths you have always known but perhaps forgotten. You have learned tonight that authenticity matters more than performance, that self-compassion is the foundation rather than the reward of practice, that comparing your insides to others' outsides creates endless suffering, that meeting mistakes with honesty is wiser than pretending perfection, that your essential worth is not dependent on external recognition, that sometimes silence speaks more loudly than words, that planting trees for unknown future generations connects you to something timeless, that rest is not a destination but a way of being, that questions can become prisons unless balanced with direct experience, and that life is happening now, not someday when conditions are perfect. The great teacher Dogen once wrote, "Enlightenment is like the moon reflected on the water. The moon does not get wet, nor is the water broken. Although its light is wide and great, the moon is reflected even in a puddle an inch wide. The whole moon and the entire sky are reflected in dewdrops on the grass, or even in one drop of water." What he meant is this: the awakening you seek is not far away, not reserved for special people, not dependent on perfect conditions or years of preparation. It is as close as your next breath, as available as this present moment, as simple as meeting your actual experience with openness and kindness. You do not need to become someone different to find peace. You do not need to achieve some special state or accumulate more knowledge or wait for better circumstances. The peace you have been seeking has been seeking you, waiting patiently for you to stop running towards some imagined future and finally arrive here where you have always been. As your breathing continues its gentle rhythm and your body sinks deeper into rest, let go of any need to remember these teachings. They have already done their work, planting seeds in the deep soil of your awareness. Those seeds will grow in their own time, bearing fruit you cannot yet imagine. Let go of any effort to fall asleep correctly. Sleep will come when sleep comes, and whether that is soon or later, you are exactly where you need to be. Let go of any judgment about your practice or your progress or your spiritual development. You are complete as you are, and you can use a little improvement, and both of these truths are simultaneously valid. Let go of the day that has passed with all its challenges and imperfections. Let go of tomorrow with all its uncertainties and responsibilities. They will take care of themselves. You are held right now in the arms of the present moment, and the present moment is infinitely gentle with those who surrender to it. The Buddha's final words before his death were, "All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with awareness." But tonight, let the striving rest. Let awareness simply be what it is, clear and present, without any need to improve or achieve or become. You are the sky, and everything else is weather. The storms pass through you, but do not define you. The calm passes through you, but does not limit you. You are the vast, spacious awareness in which all experience arises and dissolves, including the experience of these words, including the experience of your body settling into sleep, including the experience of consciousness itself beginning to soften and fade. Let everything be exactly as it is. Let yourself be exactly as you are. This radical acceptance is not passivity, but the deepest form of peace available to human consciousness. As you drift now toward sleep, know that the ancient monks whose stories we shared tonight are with you in spirit. Ryokan, who discovered authenticity, Daiichi, who learned self-compassion, Keido, who planted trees for unknown futures, Genki, who made mistakes without shame. All of these teachers and countless others who walk the path before you, they are whispering the same message through the centuries. You are enough. You have always been enough. The peace you seek is not elsewhere. It is here now, in this breath, in this moment of letting go. Rest now, dear friend. Let sleep come naturally as a flower blooms without effort or force. Let your consciousness soften like wax melting near a warm flame. Let your awareness expand like water poured onto flat ground, spreading in all directions without resistance. And know that when you wake, whether in a few hours or at dawn's light, you will wake to the same truth that the Buddha discovered under the Bodhi tree, that you have never been separate from the peace you sought, that you have always been whole, that the journey you have been on has simply been the process of remembering what you forgot, returning home to yourself. May you rest deeply. May you wake refreshed. May you carry these teachings not as concepts in your mind, but as presence in your heart. May you walk the path with gentle steps, treating yourself and all beings with the kindness that reflects our shared nature. The monastery bells are ringing somewhere in the distance, marking the end of evening practice. The stars are emerging one by one in the darkening sky. The world is settling into the sacred silence that comes before sleep. And you, faithful practitioner, are exactly where you need to be. Rest now. Simply rest. The path continues tomorrow, but for now there is only this: breath, body, awareness, and the infinite kindness of the present moment, holding you tenderly as you drift into dreams. May you be peaceful. May you be happy. May you be free from suffering. May you rest in the natural great peace that is your birthright and your true home. Good night, dear friend. We at Come Buddha Path are grateful for your presence. May your heart be calm and your sleep deep.